Hi, everyone, as you come trickling in. I would tell you to be quiet as you enter, but you are. So welcome, come on in. We're going to wait about a minute before we get started. Hi, Lee, thank you for coming in. Hey, Pam. Welcome, Andrew and Will and Chris McKnight. Hey, John. Lucas, Natasha, welcome. Hey, Sean, thank you for coming in. Arden, it's lovely to see you. Well, I don't see you, but it's lovely to see your name. Keep trickling in, guys. Thank you so much for joining us on a Saturday. We will start in about 30 seconds. As like a true producer, I have a clock here, and I will be timing everything. Hello. Natasha, if you have a question, please throw it in the Q&A. I see your hand is raised. At the bottom of everyone's screen, you'll see the little tools for Zoom. There's a box that says Q&A. If you have a question, please throw it in there for me. Okay. We are going to get started, and anyone else that joins will join us. Good afternoon or good morning. I guess you could still say it's morning. My name is Afia Lusu, and I'm the first vice president and the chair of the workshop committee for the National Academy of Television Arts and Science. I'm also the the workshop chair for the Chicago Midwest chapter. I don't know. I can't speak this morning. I've yet to have any caffeine, and I don't normally have caffeine, but I need it. So excuse me. Thank you guys for joining us on a Saturday, especially leading into a holiday weekend. That means a lot to all of us here on the call, as well as everyone that's part of the Chicago Midwest chapter. These workshops are held in an effort to help enrich, educate, and encourage journalists and television film production crews. All of our workshops can be found on the NATAS website. When you hit the workshop tab, you will see our past workshops as well as ones that are coming up. And please feel free to check chicagoemmyonline.org, and you click that workshop tab, and you will see our past workshops as well as this one. This workshop is being recorded. And it will be posted in a couple of days for you to share and to watch back at any time. Again, at the bottom of the screen is a little box that says Q&A. If you have a question, please put your question in there. I will be monitoring those and sharing those with our moderator, who is today Mark Zoromski, the retired director of student media at Marquette, Diederich College of Communication. So I will turn things over to Mark, and he will introduce our panel. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Afia, and welcome to everybody. I am so honored to take part in such an important seminar. It is a Saturday, and it's not just any Saturday in Wisconsin. It is a holy day. It is the opening of Wisconsin's deer hunting season. I actually was going to wear my blaze orange because that's a safety thing, but I decided against it. We are so fortunate to be joined by some extraordinary panelists. Tom Durkin is the program director for the James W. Foley Legacy Foundation. Tom worked with safety experts and journalists across the country to develop the James Foley journalist safety curriculum and routinely conduct safety seminars such as this one. The most recent, I think, being at the National Press Club. Tom is also a researcher and grant writer at Marquette University's Center for Peacemaking, and he teaches classes in peace studies and occasionally in English, I'm told. Ron Smith is the executive director of the Milwaukee Neighborhood News Service, a nonprofit news organization that covers Milwaukee's diverse neighborhoods. They give voice to and shed light on the challenges facing Milwaukeeans who are often ignored by broader media outlets. before taking over NNS. Ron, affectionately known as Ron Shine to his colleagues, was managing editor for news at USA Today, and before that, deputy managing editor at the Journal Sentinel here in Milwaukee. Ron also played a role in the development of the safety curriculum. Kathleen, good timing. Kathleen McElroy is a professor in the School of Journalism and Media at the University of Texas at Austin. She has 30 years experience, professional experience in journalism, including associate managing editor at the New York Times. Kathleen is also the co-director of the Center for Ethical Leadership at Media at UT Austin, and is a member of the Foley Foundation's newly formed Journalist Safety Curriculum Task Force. And we are so honored to have Jim Foley's mom, Diane, with us today. As founder and president of the Foley Foundation. You normally would find Diane in the halls of Congress or at the White House, advocating for captured journalists and all Americans held hostage or wrongly detained. Diane has pressured the White House under 3 different presidents to raise the profiles of American held overseas. She is internationally known and advocating at conferences around the world. Diane, thank you so much for being here. I want to start with you, Diane, and talk just a little bit about the great work that the Foley Foundation does, but also about Jim. I imagine you've been awfully busy these past few weeks. Can you tell us a little bit about what the Foley Foundation does? And these are dangerous times for journalists, both domestically and abroad, aren't they?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you so very much. I'm delighted to meet with you good folks out in Milwaukee. That's one of Jim's favorite places. He was a proud alum of Marquette University, where he studied history, actually in Spanish. He eventually found journalism a few years later through a graduate degree at Northwestern Medill School of Journalism. The Foley Foundation was started less than a month after Jim's murder. Jim had been targeted and kidnapped because he was a journalist in Syria in 2012 and held hostage, eventually killed by ISIS. And it was shortly after that, in September of 2014, that we started the James Foley Legacy Foundation, because we felt that Americans could do much better to prioritize the return of any Americans, innocent Americans who were taken hostage abroad, be they a journalist or an educator or aid worker or whatever they might be doing in the world, because Jim was not a priority when he was taken. Our country struggled with that, and thus the American hostages all were murdered in that time frame. And the other issue that we've become so passionate about is journalist safety. We really, feel particularly our focus has been on aspiring journalists, young people who care about our freedoms and our country, and who want to get to the truth about the myriad of issues there are. So many things need to be covered in a very intentional way, but the risk for journalists is increasing. So Tom, we're very fortunate to have Tom working for us at least part-time, and he has helped us pull some of the best practices from various press freedom groups and academics. And that's why we're delighted to have this conversation with you, because it's so important. We want you to be safe because what you're doing is vital.
Yes. Diane, I'm mindful that an anniversary is coming up of Jim's capture, November 22nd, 2012. And no matter how many years pass and we move on and we try to become whole again and all those kind of things, those anniversaries hurt. So I know my the anniversary of my most horrible day falls on Thanksgiving this year. So I just want you to know that our prayers are with you and your family. I would like to talk just a little bit about Jim, because I have a lot of favorite quotes, and one of them about death and tragedy is, they say a person dies twice, once when they draw their last breath and once when their name is spoken for the last time. And it's important that we keep talking about Jim, right? To keep him alive. And I hope you don't mind if we talk just a little bit about him, and then we'll kind of move on. But I'll start with a little story. Back in 2016, when Jim was posthumously inducted into the Milwaukee Press Club Hall of Fame, one of my students was chosen to write his bio for the program and then introduce Tom, who accepted the award on Jim's behalf. And, she turned in the first draft and it was pretty good. But I wasn't thrilled with the lead, and I didn't think that it captured kind of the essence of what, at least from my knowledge of Jim, what Jim was all about. So I challenged her to think about something, and I said, think about this and come back to me tomorrow. I said, what do you find the most remarkable thing about Jim? And the next day she burst into the newsroom and came running up to me and she said, that he went back. And I said, yep. You got it now. Now go and rewrite with some feeling and try to capture that passion that and dedication that Jim had. So for those of you who don't know, Jim was abducted and held captive twice. The first time he was held captive for 44 days in Libya. He was finally released. He came back home, Diane, right? Then went back. Can you talk about that a little bit? I mean, who does that, right? Can you talk a little bit about Jim and his passion?
Well, Jim was a passionate person, there's no question. And I think it took him a while to find journalism, actually. A lot of his journey, much of it started in Milwaukee. Marquette borders on some neighborhoods that really struggle in many ways. There's some poverty and issues. And I think in many ways, Jim's eyes were open to some inequities and stories that needed to be told in many ways. And he was very passionate about some tutoring and things he did. When he graduated, he worked in Teach for America, working in inner city of Phoenix at that time, later in Holyoke, Mass, wherever he went, he found rather strange populations or areas that really needed their stories told. And he wanted to shed light on those things and eventually found journalism. And I believe the more he got into it, the more passionate he became. And Arab Spring was starting in 2011. He felt that those stories needed to be told also. A lot of staffers were leaving the Middle East because of the dangers, and he felt compelled to report on what was happening there. He really felt we Westerners needed to know. So he became very passionate, and really, I didn't realize at the time as his mother, but upon returning from Libya, he really became convinced that to really do true investigative journalists, that journalists really needed to have a moral courage. They really needed to have a courage that was willing to really investigate, no matter the cost. But that is partly why we're concerned about safety, because obviously we want journalists to be able to continue this great work and to know how to keep themselves safe while they do it.
And it does take moral courage, doesn't it? I mean, we're not just talking about conflict reporting. It takes moral courage to go on the streets and do the kind of reporting that we do all across the country. I know, again, another one of my favorite quotes is actually from Jim. He said, if I don't have the moral courage to challenge authority, to write about the things that may have reprisals on my career, if I don't have moral courage, we don't have journalism. And after learning that, Diane, that you actually met with one of the terrorists that assassinated your son, I know where he got his moral courage from. He got it from Mom. But thank you so much, and I look forward to hearing your insights on safety in the field. So let's see. Did Kathleen joined us? She had a little emergency to attend to, but I'm glad you're here. So Let's start. We're going to delve into the specifics, obviously, in a moment. But Kathleen, let's start with kind of a broad view of the way we operate as television professionals and print professionals and journalists today. Do things need to change?
Things have needed to change for a while. Excuse me, and again, my apologies for being late. I think we're in this new era of thinking of safety. There's a new culture of safety for journalists. In the past, and by the way, this is not accusing anybody, especially Jim, of being reckless, but I don't think newsrooms thought of safety first.
Mm-hmm.
I think they thought of content and how do we get the content. And there was, I think, unless you were embedded with troops or anything, like little thought about how the journalist or his, her, their camera operator, how do they work as a team? How do you send someone out to a protest? And we saw that in 2020, journalists covering the protests were very vulnerable to assaults by law enforcement or maybe by other protesters. So I think now we realize that it's not just about the content, that you have to think about the journalist's physical and emotional safety in the process of creating that content. And you end up with more complete dimensional content when the journalist thinks about these things that maybe we didn't think about before, things that the Foley Foundation has been teaching our students about. Be safe, which I know we'll talk about later. But I think newsrooms now do have to think about, what am I doing to my people? Am I taking care of them? Do they feel safe in the field? Do they feel safe in the newsroom? And I think that's one of the positive changes in journalism today. And this is no longer the era of the lone wolf. This is a team. Even if you're physically alone, you should think of yourself as culturally being part of a team.
Yes, thank you, Tom. It's all about developing safe habits, right? And trying to make those things second nature to what we do. There's so much to think about. One of the impressive things I think about the curriculum, and we're not here to kind of teach a college class, but is the breadth. All of the things that we have to think about in terms of safety. Can you just give us a couple? We're going to talk about a few of them today, but can you give us a couple of examples of, let's just say, the chapters, right? So that we can kind of give us an overview of the things that we have to think about, because obviously protests come to mind, and we'll talk about that. Natural disasters come to mind, and we'll talk about that. But there's so much more, isn't there?
Oh, there is. And just building on what Kathleen and Diane were talking about, it's really been an evolution of how we've thought about safety. When we started, we were focused strictly on conflict reporters, media working in conflict zones. And it didn't take us long to realize that threats and risks impact all media members. And this can be whether you're on the streets, or it could be in newsrooms. And so there are a lot of things to think about. And what we wanted to make sure is that we weren't thinking about these things as an add-on. Like, this is like, you learn safety after you learn all how to be a good reporter, a good camera person. You learn it in tandem with being it. That's part of being able to operate effectively, is being safe doing it. So we talk about things like how do you prepare for an assignment? And when you do a risk assessment, how do you work with sources? What are your rights when you're working in the field? We talk about things about emotional and mental health. Those are things that are more freely discussed now, but still need to be discussed more. The impact that reporting on difficult stories has on journalists. And moving past this idea that you write a story, you file it, and you simply move on without addressing the trauma that you undertake by covering these types of stories. And so then the journalist has to think about that. People in the newsroom also have to think about that. Am I sending the same team or the same person out to cover the same type of traumatic events? And what weight does it have? Am I checking in on them and their well-being? Digital security is a huge risk these days. What do we do to keep those materials safe? So I don't want it to seem overwhelming. That's not our goal. We view bringing these issues up as a form of empowerment, that I've thought about these things, that I'm aware that they exist. And this helps me to do my job more safely. This helps me protect myself, as Kathleen was saying, my team. We're in this together. Yes, it's a competitive industry, but we are all pulling on the same rope in a sense. So we want to make sure we're doing this safely. So there are a lot of elements that go into how do we prepare to be safe. And the way we view it is, if this is particularly for younger journalists, if this is taught along the way, it's almost like scaffolding. You're building on it, and you start recognizing that safety is part of this. And the last point I want to make about this is, we often talk about how media members are first responders. You're going to stories while other people are trying to get away from them. You're armed with a pen or a camera. So you have to be prepared, just like a firefighter, a police officer would want to know how to be safe. Journalists and media members need to be thinking the same way.
Yeah, thank you. Ron, it's really about becoming part of our culture, right? And our thought process. How did you talk about that, and how you've been able to implement that to the culture of NNS about, who, what, when, where, why, how, and how can I be safe?
I think, what we're talking about, it's a mindset. And in some ways, it's a reset. So for emerging journalists, so NNS is a nonprofit newsroom that covers issues of importance to Black and Brown Milwaukee residents. And sometimes our reporters have to go into neighborhoods that are distressed, as Diane talked about. I would say that, we don't define our readers by their neighborhoods, right? We define them by their resilience and how they deal with the challenges that they face. And, so we always talk about how to stay safe, and to remember that while we do stories that celebrate ordinary people who do extraordinary things, we also want to make sure that our reporters, our photographers, that they know that you don't have to be in the Middle East to be unsafe. You have to, in society, right? There's always going to be these challenges. And so what we try to do is obviously form those relationships, but make them aware, like, where are you going? When are you going? So we know we are always communicating, not out of fear, but creating a culture that they know that teamwork really does make the dream work. And it's not always life or death, but it can be. And that we're here to support that. And also to remember that everyone has to speak up and be authentic. Sometimes we're not going to know everything. If Princess has covered 3 funerals, that takes a toll. So we don't want that to happen. I remember working as managing editor for news at USA Today, and we sent one of our younger reporters. It was just really supposed to be a gathering of women who were making a difference. It was something so simple that we didn't even think that anything would happen. And it turned out someone threw a rock at her out of the blue. So we, in many ways, society has always been challenging for reporters, whether you're print, whether you're broadcast. If you're going out to talk to people, you're courting sometimes disaster, most times not, but you need to be aware of that. But now the culture has changed where, journalists we're not trusted. And so, and sometimes when we refer to as enemy of the people, that brings on a different type of heat. And anytime I get concerned when I see broadcast reporters in particular, they're going out doing the person on the street or something that has nothing that's really controversial. And they're getting ridiculed, they're getting attacked. And this is an assault on democracy. So we work with a lot of younger journalists, but this is also for the seasoned ones as well. You have to be aware, and that begins with that mindset. The second part of that is that managers, if you are a manager, you have to be aware of what's going on. You have to create a culture of accountability, of support for your workers. It is not, we can't go out and send, I remember covering for the LA Times, the Rodney King riots. They just sent us out. No one asked us about how to be safe. No one asked us about how you're doing. No one asked us any of those questions back then. And so I'm happy that out of tragedy, Diane has built something that is so important for us to continue to have these discussions, because we didn't even talk about it. So if we can't talk about it, we don't even know that these problems exist. But yet reporters, we always knew that these things existed. We just couldn't put a name to it.
Yes, thank you. So I want to kind of jump into some practical tips, right? And there's so many ways where we have to think about being safe, whether it's emotional safety, whether it's, the one that really comes to mind these days is protests, right? So we've got the DNC coming up in Chicago. We have the RNC in Milwaukee. Political reporting, as you know, has become very, very difficult. Certainly going to be even more difficult for women and people of color. So let's talk about some things that we might be able to do to try to protect ourselves when covering protests. And Tom, probably you're the most logical place to start because your curriculum is packed full of some kind of practical tips.
Well, yeah, I've been very fortunate. Like working for the Foley Foundation, I have access to people like David Rode, who was twice captured and held hostage, Jerry Van Dyke, who was held hostage by the Akani Network, and then just the journalists and reporters and media people that I have access to speak with and to pull together what they think are the best resources and the best practices. When you're thinking about things like the RNC, the DNC, like if you're coming to Milwaukee, for instance, one of the first things we would suggest is get here early. Learn this layout of the city. Don't show up the day of and not know where things are located. Like just being able to say, like, all right, here's where something's being held at the Pfizer Forum. Here's where the roads are. Here's where exit points are. And just getting a lay of the land if you have access to that. One of the things we stress to young reporters, and I particularly stress this when I'm working with Marquette students that work for The Wire, for our TV or radio, is if you're new to the city or just unfamiliar, visit it before you have to do a story. Like figure out where things are, so you're not the first time you go to any neighborhood, it's not the first time you've been there. So that's one element of it. The other thing, and this came from like just talking to different newsrooms. We've talked to like TMJ4 here in Milwaukee. We've talked to newsrooms in Roanoke, Virginia, and in Green Bay. And one of their camera people said like whenever he gets to a news location, when he steps out of the van, the very first thing he does, he takes about 30 seconds just to look around and listen, just to get a feel. Like, are there groups gathered anywhere? Is there any unrest? Is there anything developed? But just to get an assessment. And this kind of ties into, Kathleen brought up the be safe. And what we stress is be safe, meaning before everything, stop, assess, focus, and act. So you're thinking through this, and this can be a split second, but you've thought about it. You're thinking about it. So one of the things when it comes to the protests and the riots that could potentially happen is having thought through and being aware of where you're going. I did see, for instance, and I don't know if I can adjust now, but there's a question about what should you wear? Should you have
I was gonna throw that one to Diane in a second. Yeah.
Yeah, but it says
Yeah.
press, but just to start on that, that's an important conversation to have.
Yeah.
Should you be wearing your press credentials or should you be carrying them? And like that's an
So
important discussion.
The question is, and Diane, maybe you can address this, give us your thoughts. From Sean, last night, a reporter on the CBS Nightly News with Nora O'Donnell was reporting from Gaza while wearing a bulletproof vest displaying the word press in bold letters. What are your views on labeling reporters in the field, or does that make us a target?
That is a very good question, Mark. And I think it comes down again, as Tom, all of you have alluded, it really depends on the situation and and it comes down to that assessment of risk. I think that is what this mindset that Ron was talking about and such, is just always looking when you're going to do a story, assessing what is the risk. How should I dress? Is it a place where if I wear a vest that says press, am I going to be a target? I think that's an excellent question in that situation. More and more journalists are becoming targets. If the environment does not want anyone reporting on what's happening, that journalist is definitely going to be a target. So this is where there's subtleties that require a real assessment, an intentional assessment of what is the population you're dealing with and the situation.
Well, and even if we aren't wearing a bulletproof vest in a war zone, right? So that what we're covering a protest that could be turned violent. There's some things we can do to not draw attention to ourselves. I mean, Kathleen and I were talking on Wednesday about, broadcast journalists have even a bigger target because they have a camera on their shoulder. And we did, Afia had a discussion with a photojournalist in Chicago in the last couple of days, and he sent some tips. And one of the things he said was, hey, use a cell phone instead of your camera, right? And go there in an unmarked car. Right. I remember when I was at Channel 6, our logo was a big 6, and it was a series of concentric circles on the bottom of the 6, and it was on the side of our news cars, and we took it off after somebody decided that was a great target for target practice. What other things can we do in terms of protests to try to stay safe? Anybody? Kathleen.
And I will take this to managers again. Who are you sending to the protests? I mean, everyone has to have a first protest, but can you send more than one person? Are you purposely putting a person of a particular identity, sending them to that protest? Are you doing it for your good or for that person's good? That is, I said, the Kerner Commission, journalists only paid attention to the chapter on how journalists had failed Black and brown people, especially Black people, in the 1968 Kerner report. And, you want to think it's altruistic that TV stations especially started hiring African-American reporters. Well, a lot of that was because their white reporters were being beaten up while covering the protests across the country. So if you read some of the accounts of these first Black journalists, they knew they were being used. So I think as a manager, having a conversation and thinking about, in a transparent way, why you're sending this person to a protest and, what could the consequences and benefits be?
And, one of the things I think that we should probably at least throw out there is that we understand it's tough for, particularly in, smaller markets or journalists just starting out in their career, to have that conversation with their boss. But you have to be your biggest advocate, right? Because I do think it takes a little while for managers to come around to any concept like this, but you got to stand up for yourself, right, Ron?
Absolutely. I always feel like, and completely, I was going to say what you're saying, Kathleen. I agree. I think that journalism is all about relationships, right? So it's a relationship out in your community, but it's also the relationship with your boss, and to be able to have those conversations. Again, I didn't even think about in 1992 asking, like, why am I being sent out here? A lot of the Black reporters, such as myself at the LA Times, we felt like we were, the white reporters, we were feeding our stories to white reporters who didn't go out there, didn't go out into the field. We didn't get any credit other than a contribution line. And that always stuck through with me as we navigated many other challenges. And I think about in 2016, when we had an uprising in the Sherman Park neighborhood of Milwaukee. And I was leaving the Journal Sentinel to go to USA Today, but was concerned because I think it was the last week that I was in Milwaukee. And we had Journal Sentinel had sent reporters out to those neighborhoods. So we had young Asian American intern who was beat up. But then we also had two white reporters who had relationships in those communities. They knew Raquel Rutledge. They knew Ashley Lutheran. They knew who they were. And so they were like, Miss Ashley, I'm going to walk with you. So that helps when you don't pop in and parachute in, and you have to think about that. Those relationships matter. And so I always tell our reporters at NNS and other places that there's a gospel singer whose name is Pastor Shirley Caesar. She is 83, 84 years old. She sold millions of records. I bring it up because Pastor Shirley says that she's on the A team and the B team. So the A team is that she is going to work with young folks to get her records and be current. But the B team is she says she's going to be there when they leave. And I think a lot of times we come into these communities or places we don't know. We pop in. We don't study. We don't develop relationships. We don't talk to the influencers in those communities that could help us get those guidance. Sometimes we are just very like one-dimensional. We're in, we pop in, and then we pop out. And that's no longer, and it was never really a solution, but now we need to evolve. So even if you're talking about the DNC or the RNC, knowing the politics, knowing the people, establishing those relationships before you get there is going to be helpful in case something does happen. Because we do know, that there are, people planning protests already for RNC. We've heard from our neighbors that we cover at Neighborhood News Service. Some people have actually said, we're not going to be in town because we are afraid of what could happen. And so we're trying to make sure we understand that context. But there should really be no excuse for people just popping in and popping out. Yeah. We know these events are happening, and we got to do the research. Sometimes we don't have that option, right, on a day-to-day basis. And that's why it's really important to have those relationships.
I was going to say, we don't have the option to not be in town, right? So Tom, back to some specific tips about covering protests. In that first 30 seconds when you're surveying the scene, what else are you looking for?
When you go to one of these things, like, and this is what I've gathered from talking to seasoned journalists and reporters who have covered these type of situations, like looking where a police line might be, looking where your exits might be,
developing a primary and an alternate meetup point with your photojournalist or your reporter, right? If all hell breaks loose. Well,
I was going to add a few things. Like, these are things like when you're thinking about going somewhere, you should have a check-in schedule. Like, when am I supposed to check in to make sure everything's all right? Who's my contact person? What materials do you need to do your job that day? Like, are you bringing something that you're not going to need, or are you going to not have something you will need? So thinking about that. Your team, if you're working with a team, what's the point where you say this is no longer safe, that we need to withdraw? And in talking to newsrooms, a lot of what they're moving towards, and this is a cultural shift, and this is something like Kathleen was alluding to in terms of the culture. If one person feels like this has gotten too dangerous and we need to withdraw, you listen to that person. You don't try to talk them into saying, no, it's going to be all right, we keep going. If you're covering something like the RNC, DNC, where a protest can happen, do you have a basic first aid pack? Do you have water and snacks in case you need them? Do you have a backup charger? The adequate footwear and clothes. How are you dressed for the occasion? And this would tie into the question about the press. Are you going to be wearing a vest that says who you work for? Or if you're going to the situation, is it better to not? And that's part of a risk assessment that a team should think about before they get to the location.
Right.
But can I ask a question though? I mean, because some of these incidents are happening when it's a one-person team. It's not a team. This person is filming and writing. So what about that person?
And this gets back into the check-in. Like if you are a one-man band or like you're doing everything, are you checking in with somebody? We just had this morning we had on a task force that's dealing with the reporters in Gaza. There was a reporter that they hadn't heard from in 48 hours. So an alert went out. And it turns out the communications are so poor in Gaza right now that she just didn't have access to it. But the fact that she hadn't checked in 24 hours sent out an alert like, hey, we've got an issue, like, and we need to find this person. Fortunately, everything worked out, but someone needs to know you're doing this and someone needs to know where you're supposed to be at a certain time. So if you are working alone, that's one thing to be doing.
Well, I'll get to you in a second, Kathleen. To quote Dan Shelley, who's the executive director of the Radio Television Digital News Association, who travels all across the country speaking to television stations and at conferences, and he tells news managers in terms of the one-person band thing, knock it off. Of course, we're never going to change that, right? Because that's going to always be part of it's a budgetary thing, I'm sure. But Kathleen, you were gonna say something.
Yeah, we had a student reporter who was hit with a cell phone while he was covering a relatively minor protest. So I think for the one, person reporter, it's like, how deep inside do you need to go into something?
Yeah.
Like, if someone is acting violent, is that the person you should be approaching? It seems obvious, but again, I think this still goes back to risk assessment. If it doesn't feel right, then don't do it. You're not going to get a medal or a special A++ for putting yourself in a dangerous situation. It's a very good chance you won't get the story at all at that point. And the other thing, whether it's a team or one person, is, and this goes to what Ron was talking about, if possible, do you know your local law enforcements? It's not possible if you're parachuting in, and oftentimes you do have to parachute in, but this is not saying to be clubby, but if there's someone who is a police spokesperson, you should be, hey, what do you think? Get information,
Yeah, and a couple of things. Number one, I have these really excellent tips that I'm going to kind of read off about covering protests from the photojournalist in Chicago. But they're all in our safety curriculum, every single one of them. So Tom and Diane have made sure that that's available on the Foley Foundation website and free for anyone, even if you're not a teacher, right? Go through there and read the tips. But a couple of things that we talk about is, don't get between the protesters and the police, right? We get it. If you need to get in there to get great shots and great natural sound, but be wary of where you are, because if you get caught between the protesters and police, if things get out of hand, you're right there to get clubbed with the rest of them, right? With whatever is going to go down. And an interesting thing that I think we've talked about, and Diane, it seems so crass for me to ask you this, but I think again, it is the story worth someone's life.
And that's where I think journalists have to really assess that. They have to, think about what is right for them. and often there are other ways to get a story. I can't emphasize enough, ideally, to have a team. That team approach that Kathleen is mentioning. Certainly, if you have to go out alone, that you, as Tom mentioned, definitely someone knows where you are, when you're supposed to check in, when you're supposed to return, that all of that kind of thing. Because I feel things are getting more and more dangerous. And I think it's ever more important to work as a team with one's colleagues in the field, as well as the managers or editors. There definitely needs to be a culture of safety. And part of it is standing up for your own rights, that you don't feel safe going in alone, that, you think that's an important story, but you prefer to go with a colleague or such.
Right.
And Diane, I would also add, managers, be careful about the behavior that you reward. Because you set up a culture where we can say all this stuff and we agree, but then, Robin went in and she got between these protesters. That's great work, Robin. Sends the wrong message, right? It has to be a two-way conversation, and it has to be, the leadership is so important. And I tell emerging journalists, I tell seasoned journalists the same thing. You have to be your best advocate, but you also, when you're starting to interview and go places, check out that manager's track record, because that's going to affect how you live your life. Because we can all say, we would all agree that no one should risk their lives, but then what's the message that is being sent by the leadership? What's that culture? And so I think, again, I keep saying it's a mindset for journalists and a reset for journalists as well.
I want to move on because we have so many topics to cover, but if you don't mind, let me just read a couple of bullet points, because I want to make sure that we give as much practical advice as we can. And when we're talking about one-person bands, when you're in a pair with a reporter and a photojournalist, I always say this. Reporters, don't forget that your photojournalist is blindsided, right? He or she can't see from one side because they got a camera up next to their head. And so you got to protect that blind side, and you got to be able to really both watch out for each other. So just a couple of practical tips that
Mark,
go ahead, Kathleen. Yeah.
I just want to say that is so important. And by the way, I misused the term camera operator earlier. I meant photojournalist. But I want to say that Tom gave that tip to my class. And like a couple of months later, a student photographer said that the person he was working with helped him by saying, wait a second, you know what? I don't think you're in a good position.
Yeah.
And I don't care how good the shot's going to be. So those were two people who heard you, Tom. And I just wanted to point out that it does make a difference.
Yes.
And the story was just fine. But the person, the other journalist, was looking out for her teammate.
Mm-hmm. Just a couple of bullet points again from this photojournalist that Afia had a discussion with, and we're not naming the photojournalist in the station because we don't really want to put someone in a position to be speaking for their station, right? But the person said this, and some things we talked about, and most of all of this is in the curriculum as well. Pay attention to your surroundings. This person recommends taking unmarked cars, not vehicles marked with the station logo. Be aware of the neighborhood. Use your best judgment. A story isn't worth your life. Use a cell phone instead of a camera. It's a chance to get in and out quickly. Safety in numbers. Call the police and say you're a journalist and ask for a squad car to come help at a location if you're doing a live shot and you feel you need protection. If you don't feel safe doing a live shot, do it at the police station. Do the live shot outside the police station. Go to a place that's well lit, public space, and provides comfort and security. For protest rallies and politics, this person recommends taking the mic flags off with the logos, cover the camera logo with electrical tape, don't wear station gear, stand outside of the march, don't get in the middle of it. That's what we were talking about, right? Take an unmarked car, use a cell phone, don't use camera lights or floodlights, don't antagonize the police. Let's remember that the police are not there to protect us. right? They are there to try to enforce law and order. So we're not getting like, hey, protect me, I'm a journalist. Well, I'm sure they'd love to do that if they can, but they got a bigger picture they got to take care of. And a good one for everyday reporting, actually, particularly for women, don't wear your best jewelry or your designer clothing when you're out on a story, because you set yourself up for a robbery or an attack. So I want to move on. We had so many topics to cover, and let's talk a little bit about targeting. Go ahead, Kathleen.
Well, before you go, I think journalists also are aware of how law enforcement might be committing crimes or doing things while
Sure.
in the process of doing the protest. I mean, that is the tough balancing act of the journalist, because you think about the bravery of the teenager who recorded George Floyd. So there is always that fine line that journalists are doing. It helps to know your local law enforcement, but you also cannot assume they are enforcing the law.
Absolutely. Right.
So that's the only thing I wanted
It's
to
that
add.
arm's length thing, right? Yeah. Let's talk a little bit about targeting of female and minority journalists and diversity in newsrooms and those kind of things. It's tough for all of us, but I think it's additionally tough for some, right? So any thoughts about protecting yourself and trying to avoid being a target or dealing with harassment, particularly as a person of color or a woman working in the business?
Well, that's kind of a broad stroke that you set up from diversity to being attacked as a woman or a person of color. I mean, the United States has systems that oppress people who look a certain way, act a certain way because of their identity. Law enforcement can be one of them, those systems and institutions. Journalism is often one of those systems and institutions. So there's a lot going on to unpack with what you said. If you're a person of color, and on our site, our curriculum for ethical leadership and media, we have journalists talk about the ways in which they navigate their identity in newsrooms. Like, maybe you want to cover a story because you're gay, but you don't automatically want to be sent to the Pride Parade every year, right? And it's interesting because I think a lot of the work we're talking about, and I see Ron nodding his head, is about getting managers to think differently about how they treat their staff and their reporters. So much of the burden is always on that person, to do all the work. And I wish that's something we could change, is to get the burden back to the manager to think about these things. But yes, women are targeted. When you see 90% of the sideline reporters who are female, what they're experiencing and hearing while they're trying to do their job is just horrific. I tell my female grads, if you're going to work for a place and they don't have an online harassment policy, especially for women, think twice about it, because their women are being harassed. Do they have a policy that addresses it? So you bring up an excellent point there, Mark.
And if I can build on for a second, like that policy is so important, because we know the studies show the vitriol, particularly online harassment, the cyber bullying, the trolling, is off the charts for women and journalists of color. And that's a health of the industry question, because then we lose young people because the burden is too great to continue in the field. So it's not just about, it is about the individual, but it's about journalism and media writ large, because this impacts the health of media.
I would just tack on what Kathleen and what you're saying, Tom. An example of when you're using people effectively and not as decorations, like, sending the gay person to the Pride Fest, sending the Black person to write about Black history. When George Floyd protests were happening in Milwaukee in 2020, Princess and Mia, who are two African-American reporters for us, they were in a meeting and they said, what's weird about Milwaukee? We don't see any Black and brown women at the protests. And I said, why is that? And they both said, we don't know. So they actually went out and talked to, because they noticed, because they're part of the community, who wasn't at the table. Princess found a woman who, an activist from Milwaukee, had gone to Minneapolis when the George Floyd protests were erupting. And she came back to Milwaukee determined, like, wow, they got it organized. I'm going to organize it here. And then after we talked to 12 to 16 of these activists, we found out that they didn't feel it was a safe space for them to protest. So they were there, they were willing to protest, but they felt it was homophobic, it was very patriarchal, and these were being led by people in our community. And we talked to some of the organizers, but we would have never had that story had we not had those two reporters who knew that we would want to broadcast that kind of story and listen to their voices. And so, it's a really complicated question because, for many years, I've always talked, journalism, we have to have this parity. I've been hearing this for 40 years. I don't know about you, Kathleen, but I keep hearing that, and it's so hard to find people. But my staff is 80% people of color. So maybe it's not that hard to find people. Maybe the question is, what are we looking for?
Diane, I was just about to ask this question, and then a question came up in the chat as well. So you have obviously developed a lot of exceptional negotiating skills throughout your work, particularly your work with trying to get the State Department to pay attention to captured journalists and Americans and to and those kind of things. How does a staffer, right, whether let's say a female or a person of color or a gay journalist who doesn't have any allies in the newsroom, how do you begin to have that conversation with the managers about your need for support?
Well, I think that is something we need to teach journalists, how to negotiate, if you will, with folks. And just to get back to one thing that Kathleen was saying, the Alliance for a Culture of Safety, which was also started shortly after Jim and Stephen Sotloff were killed, it's an international group of media, press freedom, and freelancers to give them access to things that staffers and big media companies may have. But one of the things they've done is they've emphasized the importance of educating editors, because I think you're making a very important point, Kathleen. And so some of that is out there. That is essential. And I think young aspiring journalists need to do that. They need to, when they interview for jobs, they need to find out what is the culture of that place. They also need to find out about policies, about harassment, about online security, all of these kinds of things. And I do think we need to give young journalists questions that they need to check on, because I think you're making an excellent point. They need to know what they're getting into. And some of those situations may be editors who could care less about the safety of their reporters. And so that is an important skill for them to have too. It really is.
Any specific tips on if you are the target of a hostile individual or hostile crowd or whatever when you're out on the job? Are there ways to try to diffuse that situation?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I mean, I think that is part of, we were talking about that with one of the students at Marquette, about how to de-escalate. and to slowly back off. Remember that student, Tom?
Yeah, that's a great point. It was interesting because the student was asked about something that happened. She was with her and a camera person, or a photojournalist who was filming a story near campus, and another person came into their space and was being aggressive. And the student said, I wish I had learned how to deal with that situation. And then she explained how she kept the camera rolling and just just was talking at a normal level and just kind of was working her way back towards campus, not being aggressive. And she did everything right. And then and we're like, how did you know how to do that? And she was like, well, we talked about it in class. Mm-hmm. And so she didn't realize that she had learned how to de-escalate. Like they kept the camera going. They didn't turn the camera off and make sudden movements. They just kept talking in an even keeled voice and just worked their way back towards where there was more people. There was more of the closer to campus, and she didn't realize she had learned that, which is in a sense that's exactly what we want. It was part of her being a journalist. She had learned this in class. Like, when I'm out on the scene, this is something I should do. So she was able to de-escalate and safely get back.
But our natural reaction when somebody's being aggressive toward us or yelling at us is to yell back, right? So, any tips on de-escalating, or is that it? Just stay calm and.
Well, I mean, obviously, what you'd like to do is if are there other people around? Are you in a desolate area? Are other people around? Is there a place you can go to? This is also where, if you had visited the area before, and where you set up to do this story, is there a store, a bank, a police station, a public building that you could go into? So where are you setting this up in case something like this would happen? But again, and this is also where there's strength in numbers. It would be a lot different if you're by yourself doing this story versus this student had a team member with her.
We talked about Kathleen. Thank you. I was actually coming to you next, but go ahead.
I was going to say, what Tom is saying is so important. Also, go into that shop ahead of time, or, say, I may be shooting outside, you may be in the back of my thing, And, it could be where you end up with someone who now becomes is invested in your getting the best segment possible.
They watch your back a little bit.
So I think that I just wanted to add on to that's a great idea, Tom.
We skipped over safety assessment a little bit, but there is a bit of a formal process that we might want to go through before every story, right, Tom?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, there's a basic template you can work with, and it's in our curriculum, so you can pull it up. And it's a risk assessment for journalists and a risk assessment for newsroom managers. And the process is and again, this is when you're starting off, you should do these. Our recommendation, the recommendation we receive from experts, is you should do this for any story you're going to do, and especially ones that so it becomes habit. It's something that you can then eventually just do it, even if you're going to a breaking news story, because you've thought about this. But a basic assignment outline. What are the risks? What's your project? What's your goal? The location. Where am I going? What's my schedule look like? Some of the details. What do you need to film or record? Do you have to meet with certain people? What's the basic foundation of this project? Are there specific risks that you should be aware of? Is it a sensitive topic? Has there been a lot of discussion on this that's created animosity? We see this in politics, but you can go to a school board meeting these days that can go sideways. So is it a high-risk location? Is it or activity? Who are you meeting? Do they know that, or are you just hoping to find someone to meet? Is your security threatened? Does your profile put you at risk? Mm-hmm. Does the person that you're looking to interview, will they be put at risk if they're talking to someone from the media? What's your travel plans? How do you plan to get somewhere and back? Do you have a backup plan? So these are all things like when you're starting out, if you can get in the habit of doing it, especially for young, aspiring, emerging journalists, this is something that you will naturally do. That's our belief. It will become just a habit. These are the things I'm going to think through.
Yeah. Ron, that sounds like a lot. You know, we rush from story to story. Do we have time to think about safety before we head out?
We have to make time for that. And again, it's that mindset. We definitely have to do it. And I would also say, you know, we keep saying the safety curriculum is for students and, you know, emphasizing for emerging journalists. I'm going to say that's for anyone, whether you've been in the business for 30 years or for 30 days. You could benefit by just taking a glance at the curriculum, because there's so many things that even I felt when Tom and Diane were talking about this that I was learning or that I hadn't thought about, that I needed to rethink. And it's really, think about it, if you are a working professional, it's not a curriculum, it's a safety resource. And it is something that we all need to be aware, because we can't do better if we don't know better. And here's a way to do that. So, but to answer your question, Mark, it's absolutely, it doesn't take that much time to think about these things. And at the end of the day, you're alive.
I think what Tom was saying is that if you practice it a little bit, it then becomes second nature. And it's, you know, I always think about, and actually I was doing electrical work again this week, and I'm not particularly good at it, but I know enough to be safe, right? So, you know, I have several devices that I use. One, there's a little beeper, and you run it across the cable, and you think you turn the breaker off, but you double check to make sure it'll beep if there's electrical current running through there. And it's just something I never think about, I just do. And that's the point we want to get to, right? That's the point we want all journalists and managers to get to the point where they're thinking not only about who, what, when, where, why, and how, they're thinking that extra H, how can we be safe? Let's talk a little bit about natural disasters. We've all been assigned to go out and cover a flood or a tornado, and actually electrical comes into mind there too, because you know, engineers in the days of microwave trucks were taught to look up before they put that mast up, right? There's a window in the roof of the truck to look up, make sure you're not putting it into power lines. But do reporters know, you know, I'm going to put my waders on and go stand in the water and do this stand up? Well, do they know to look for downed electrical wires, right? Because if there's a live wire in that water that you're going to stand in, that's the end. So tips about covering natural disasters. I know we have a chapter on it.
The first thing I would start with is this ties in directly with what Kathleen and Ron and Diane have been saying about like researching communities. Like you should research the topic you're doing. If you're going to cover a natural disaster or a extreme weather event, what do you know about this type of extreme weather? Like what do you really know about like a tornado and how they move, and like where you can position yourself? Like me personally, like that, I would know nothing. I would have to but I wouldn't go cover it until I did some research. Like I know I'll be asked to cover extreme weather. What can happen with these things? That's one element of it. The second would be what your safety like threshold, like how close can you get to something like this? How good of a shot or how perfect of a shot do you need to show what's happening with extreme weather? And the third, which I think can often be overlooked, is if you're going to interview somebody that is part of this, they can be going through some extreme trauma. If their neighborhood, their community is being pummeled or injured or hurt by extreme weather, what's your approach to them? How do you ask somebody about an extreme weather event when you're not sure how they've been impacted by it yet, and what you might be in a sense re-traumatizing someone who's going through something? I think these are things that need to be thought about, like as opposed to just we're going to get that shot of like the umbrella blowing away and I can barely stand, but like there's a lot of real risk involved with covering these types of stories.
Kathleen, there's no raising hands in my classroom here, young lady.
And then I'm going to run off and plug in my computer because I got here in such a hurry that my computer's about to die. To add to what Tom is talking about, we think about the photographer who took the famous photo of the child by the vulture, and would that happen today? The other element of that is, if you're with the media, people are going to see you as that first responder and maybe asking for help. When there were serious floods here in Texas, I heard from so many publishers and editors who said that people started calling them as if they were 911 because they couldn't get through the police and stuff like that. So I think your newsroom should also think about, what's my policy? Am I going to need to help rescue people? Am I going to need to convey information to the police? I just think that's another element that you might not be thinking of. And also, if this is happening and you live in that community, is my family safe? So now you're dealing with a double-edged situation here. If that protest is taking place in your neighborhood, is my family safe? Is my house safe? If that tornado is taking place, in a lot of ways, journalists are more affected by, and I was in New York during 9/11. I personally was not as affected as journalists who were in New Orleans for Katrina or in Alabama for tornadoes and things like that. They were dealing with trying to cover this as a news story while making sure their families and their properties are safe. So I just think that's another element. Are you going to be in a position where you need to help other people unexpectedly, or are you going to need to be in a position to help your family?
I want to go back to Tom earlier likened what we do to first responders, right? We rush in, right? And so we got a question from the chat that I think we need to be mindful of that we rush in, right? And so the question is, we keep talking about researching neighborhoods and communities, but the reality is we don't have that opportunity when we're to scope out an area, when we're redirected to breaking news. So how are we supposed to navigate someone's grief, but also get the story?
Sorry about that. Your smartphone, Google, do other things. You should never, ever go into a place in which you haven't, even if you're Googling nearby restaurants, nearby churches, nearby whatever. I just feel as if, the way we use this device can help us in these situations. But I would like to hear from Ron and Tom on that.
One of the things that has come up when we talk to reporters and in terms of best practices and media members, if they're gonna interview someone that may have experienced grief, is don't go in with the mic. Start the conversation first. Hi, I'm so-and-so, I'm looking, I'd like to talk with you. Explain why you want, what's the purpose of the talk? Are you willing? So it's not like a mic in someone's face, or you're immediately in reporter, journalist, broadcast journalist mode. You're allowing someone even a little bit of time to think through, okay, I get it. You want to ask me this. And it's not just the beginning of the conversation, it's the end of the conversation. Where do you leave that person at the end? Do you make sure that they're in a as good a space as possible? Because if you're asking someone to retell a story that re-traumatizes in a way, you have an ethical responsibility to make sure that person, when you're done with the story, it's not just, all right, well, thanks, I'm leaving. We've talked to people who, journalists or reporters who have said, can I get you a glass of water? Can I get you tea? I'll check back in with you. I want you to know that this story will be used like this, and where we want to tell your story. So there are ways of approaching somebody and of leaving somebody.
Ron, I'm interested in your thoughts, but I want to put you on hold for just a second because I want to go to Diane, because there's probably nobody that knows better about being approached by reporters in the absolute worst moments of your life. And can you talk a little bit about the approaches that people may have asked you for interviews and the ones that handled it as correctly as humanly possible?
I really feel this is very important to me, because I've been approached all different ways, for sure. You know, I've been approached by some very sensitive, kind journalists who really allowed me to relax enough to really answer their questions. And I've also been approached by people very abrupt and unfeeling and very almost hurtful, like Tom was saying, shoving a mic in my face or that kind of stuff. So I really feel that the best interviews will come from a journalist who's able to establish a rapport, a relationship, in that they really want to listen. They're not as concerned about their questions. It's really hearing what the interviewee wants to share and being empathetic and kind about that. I really feel that makes a huge difference in terms of the quality of story.
I've noticed over my career that the reporters who get those kind of interviews, I don't think it's a coincidence that they're some of the most empathetic people I've ever worked with. I think that goes hand in hand, doesn't it? It's an incredible quality to have as a journalist.
Mark, I would say, like, one thing I've always said about Jim Foley, who was my best friend from going back to our first year in college. He was, without question, and this is why he was such a good journalist, a good writer, a good photojournalist, without question, the best listener I've ever met in my life. He heard you, and he basically, and Diane can speak to this too. He basically interviewed anyone he talked to. You didn't get much information out of Jim, but he was asking you questions, and you were willing to open up to him, even as a friend, because it was obvious he heard you, and he was asking questions that went with what you were saying. He wasn't trying to get you to say something. He was trying to hear what you had to say.
Ron, so we're rushing to a scene. We don't have, because we rush, right? Do we have, how do you navigate someone's grief and also get the story when you're redirected and you're sent there? It's breaking news.
I think it's being transparent and authentic. First of all, you are a person relating to another person, telling them what you're trying to do, apologizing, or asking if they want to talk, and telling them what you're trying to do. But I also think I don't want to let journalists off the hook. Yes, we do go to places unexpected, but these neighborhoods have always existed, and we have got to move from being transactional to being transformational. And that, I can say that having one of the smallest newsrooms in the city, actually maybe one of the biggest ones because of the decline of local journalism. But, we go into the community, not always to get a story. We go to listen. And, we learn things just by going out once a month. And that's, all we can do with our as an organized staff. But we go out into the community and say to a group that's working with the community, what are you hearing? What do you want from us? If you were Ron Smith, what would you do? And we've done this 15 times this year, and we have created a new beat. It's going to be gun violence, because that's what everyone has talked about at every meeting. But I think as journalists, we ought to be more curious and not just kind of, again, parachute in. We're local journalists. We can meet with people. We can meet with influencers. We can go to community events, and not just to write a story, but to listen. Hey, Kathleen, what's going on? How you doing? And develop those relationships, which build in time, that helps build trust. Because one of the problems I think we have, at least in the mainstream journalism, is that people don't trust us because they only hear from us when there's something bad going on.
Right.
When we're trying to abstract. So we have to, yes, sometimes we're going to come to situations we have no control over. If I'm a TV reporter, I may not know every neighborhood in Milwaukee. I get that. But what are you doing to diversify your sources, to work with influence makers, to find out? And then the second part is, once you've done that story, following up with the people you talk to. It's a requirement at NNS that if they interview Mark Zoromski, when a story comes out, they got to send an email to Mark, find out how it works, how it's done. Sometimes we've learned things like, oh, we got that wrong. Oh, we're sorry. Let's get that correct. A lot of times we ask them, what do you know? Anything else we should have covered? How do you feel? So there's a relationship. Even when they're mad, they're glad that we have asked that question.
Mhm. Well, first of all, you all are extraordinary. And I got to tell you, so is our audience, because these questions that are being fed to me like come at the perfect time, just when I'm about to move into a new topic. And so I want to move into addressing emotional trauma, and that's a big category, right? And here's a question that I just got. Quote, "I am burnt out. These post-pandemic years are draining," in all caps. "Would you consider mental health to be a safety issue? How do I get back to me? Because I really love storytelling, but I'm tired of the crime coverage, extreme weather coverage, crazy political rallies, etc." All right, panelists, guide us. Kathleen wants to go.
I just want to say that you are burnt out, that journalism burnout is a real thing. There's been research on it. There is a lot of information on this now, especially because of COVID, because it was affecting you again as a human being, and you were supposed to cover this thing. So there's no relief. It is a definite mental health issue. Many journalists have left because of it. And if you're in a newsroom, you hope that there would be resources. And this is where, again, the manager, and I have been evil management. The management has to understand what reporters are going through. And I would say there is a burden on whoever this person's manager is to recognize the burnout and to also know that there are different types of stories. I have a recent grad who came to me. She's been in Uvalde for like the past 2-3 months. And she's Latina. And this has been so hard because she is empathetic and she is building relationships. And she just so feels for these families.
Yeah. Yeah.
So part of my thing was coaching her on how to tell her boss, I do something else.
Yeah. Diane.
All I was going to add, that's so true. And that's part about that person who gave that story. It is time for a break. There's no question. You know, there's a time to be honest with your editor and yourself that one needs to do something else. And I recently got a new book from a friend of mine. I don't know, there's a psychiatrist by the name of Anthony Feinstein out of Toronto, Canada. He's done a lot of work about moral injury and related to moral courage. He has a recent book called Moral Courage. It's an outstanding book. And it talks a lot about, because you care, like your student who was in Uvalde, it's exhausting and you know, you're just totally drained, and you need to, and an editor needs to recognize that that kind of a person needs a break, needs a chance to do a different kind of a story, needs time to recoup and heal, maybe counseling, you know, maybe, you know, whatever is needed in that regard. But that doesn't mean you're not a good reporter. It means the opposite, probably. It means that you've really entered into the experience of many of the people you've been working with, but that you may well need a break and need to step back and some time from healing.
And easy for me to say, a little harder to do, but if indeed we have the moral courage it takes for all of us to do our jobs on a daily basis, we need to have the moral courage to talk to our bosses in situations like this, right?
Right, to have that crucial conversation, because editors are also stressed out too, right? They have to do more with less, and they don't know. So if you don't say something, you have to be your own best advocate. And, you know, to figure out ways to have those kind of conversations. Again, that relationship is really even more important. But what you can't do, I've learned the hard way sometimes, is I thought my editor could read my mind. And she had 30 things to do. And had I raised that issue, it would have been solved. And so it's not always going to be, you know, I don't want to paint managers or leaders as care, you know, they don't care. They're juggling many, many things just like you are, and they're just as stressed as you are. And so if they don't know, they can't help. So the first part is, you know, first, there's nothing wrong with being burnt out. Like that, We all get tired. I always say I'm tired and inspired, but I'm getting tired. So I need a break, right? So we all need to be our own advocate, and we cannot let other people dictate our happiness.
And to build on this, I think one of the stuff, and this is, I've talked to a number of journalists who have experiences. There's a guy, Mike Betcher, who works out of the University of Oklahoma, who did a documentary called Hornet's Nest. We had a conversation about his experiences in Afghanistan, and he said how he kept everything in the mid 2000s. It all came out at one time, and he felt like he hit rock bottom because he held everything in. Just 2 weeks ago, we had a conversation with Sean Carberry, who's a former National Public Radio writer, and he's been in and out of war zones. And he just wrote a book called Passport Stamps, if we're doing book plugs right now. Passport Stamps, that talks about his experience and like this feeling of depression and emotional struggles. I think one of the keys is we have to acknowledge that it's not a sign of weakness for this to happen. You're covering emotional stories. We've been through a pandemic. You are reporting on things that cause trauma, and burnout is real. Feeling emotional trauma is real, and self-care is essential for effective reporting, effective journalism, effective broadcast media. And hopefully more and more newsrooms are encouraging these conversations and encouraging journalists and reporters to say, listen, I need that break right now. I've been covering this type of story. I've been covering this one story for so long, and that it's acknowledged, and it does not become, well, we can't trust that reporter to go out anymore, because that cannot be the model. That's the culture that needs to change.
But interesting, and I want to stay on this topic because it like Kathleen said, this is real, right? And it is a safety issue, emotional trauma. But we're in a very competitive business, both amongst your competitors and then in your newsroom, right? There's competition among reporters that want, I think at times, and I think we mentioned this, but I'm not sure that we really kind of went in depth. We have a question: what recourse do reporters have who faced blowback from bosses for any hesitance to covering a dangerous situation?
An easy thought is that you need to leave that situation. You need to leave that job, but of course you can't do that.
Particularly if you're under contract and all those.
Exactly. And so this is where I think what Foley does, the Foley Foundation, this is why I hope, webinars like this will give people the resources and the tools they can bring to their bosses. In that moment, your life is always more important than the story.
And we have a lot of work to do with managers, right? I think that's clear, and I know that Diane and Tom, you've worked with Dan Shelley from the RT DNA, and that's one of the things that the Radio Television News Directors Association that Dan is preaching to news directors across the country, saying, you got to listen to your staff, your reporters, your photojournalists, your editors. When they tell you they're burnt out, you can't just tell them to suck it up, right? And you've got to pay attention to physical safety and emotional safety, but that's going to take some time, right? And change can come from the bottom up, right? And so that, I think that's one of the things is we want to make sure that reporters, photojournalists, editors, whatever, feel empowered enough to have those conversations with their bosses.
And I will add, in spite of the Michigan scandal and things like that, football coaches realize that we need to step up the safety game, right? And they have. And they've taught players to tackle differently. So we're just saying that physical and emotional safety needs to be a part of journalism. I remember hearing, and this is something that Ron had said earlier, so I know this sounds like a digression, but you know, I remember a football coach yelling at one of his players, even though the player scored a touchdown. That was not the way the play was designed. So if somebody does something that's reckless, it needs to be identified as reckless. Yeah, you got that story, but that, and I don't know why I put my phone on mute, but you have got to say that's reckless. That's not the way we do things.
And I think as journalists, we also have to learn how to have difficult conversations. As Diane was saying, how do we negotiate that? So it doesn't become one conversation, maybe it becomes a series of conversations. I'm feeling burnt out because of A, B, C, and D. I'm hoping that, here's some solutions that I think might work. How can you help me? Like, so it doesn't become, I don't believe people come into journalism to be quote, quote, assholes. Although I've had a number of bosses that were, but most were not. Mm-hmm. But being able to have crucial conversations has to be added to all our arsenal, and how we deal with things. Because sometimes we are, I've been caught off guard. I didn't know that happened, right? And I could reset. So sometimes we assume the manager knows more than he or she knows. Sometimes the manager has other constraints. And I think learning how to work within that system, learning to work with your teammates, because maybe it's not just, if you're feeling burnt out, you're not the only one, right? So maybe then there's a team talk that can happen that doesn't threaten anyone, but saying, hey, we're feeling this kind of way in our newsroom. Here's solutions that we can think of. How can we get past this so everyone is doing their best work?
Diane, you've talked to a lot of people who I'm sure wouldn't listen at the State Department and other places. So what's the key? What's the key to get them to listen?
I think one of the things is persistence, and listening to the issues they're having. I mean, there's reasons a lot of times why things happen, if you will. And not taking things maybe personally, but just looking at the issues as opposed to the people involved, that you may really disagree with how things were handled. Like I certainly did. I was appalled at how our government handled the captivity of the 4 young Americans in 2012. But it didn't help to hate them or, criticize them publicly, that kind of thing. But it did help to be persistent about saying that we can do better. We really must do better. That as a nation in my situation, that there had to be a better way to prioritize our folks. And I feel the same way about in media groups, that there has to be a way to protect our journalists. Without our journalists, we're not going to have any idea what's going on in the world or in our own country for that matter. So go ahead, Tom.
Oh, I was going to add, like, one of the things I would recommend, because this is how it works with the universities when we're trying to get them to incorporate safety, right? We say, well, this is what this other school is doing, and this is how it's working, and this is how it's effective.
Good point.
Most media members will know what other media organizations do. So it's not just about identifying what's wrong with the system you might work in, but what would improve it? So you don't just come and say, this is, I don't like this, I don't like this, I don't like this. It's also, it could be a constructive in terms of, here's one strategy that might make it, like, you come with a plan as well. Like, this is something that's working at this organization, or could we try this? Like, so it's not just about saying what's wrong, but what's your sense on how things would be improved? Like, are you comfortable with sharing that?
And ultimately, you end up with better content consistently. I mean, and, we were saying all this, doing this for the journalists, do this for this, but you're also doing this for news consumers. If your reporters feel physically and emotionally safe, they are going to be better reporters. They're going to produce content that works. I mean, I think I said this in one discussion we had. If an A+ report could get your reporter hurt or injured. It's not worth it. A good B plus. Some days say, okay, we're aiming for, this is a tornado, this is a flood. We're aiming for a B plus here. We're aiming for a B, if that's what it takes. So to Tom's point, yeah, this can be a positive in many ways. This is not just that we're soft. No, I think all of this produces better journalism.
I agree. It's kind of how can you tell the story of other people if you can't tell your story?
Right. Let's move to something that I'm terrible at. So I have nothing to say about it, and I'm going to listen intently as you give advice. Dealing with keyboard warriors and online bullying. That is a safety concern, isn't it? It's an emotional safety concern. So, all right, go enlighten us.
Well, Kathleen has talked about this, and and so I would defer to her to start, but about this, whether or not your company has a policy on this. Like, what's the policy? Like, I shouldn't have to deal with this on my own, and trying to identify lines, and it's not always the easiest. I mean, when does trolling become a real threat, and what's the process for this? One, I would never encourage a journalist to go through all the comments. But if you are getting somebody, if there's like somebody going through that's consistent, does this rise above, I'm just being trolled versus this is a threat? This is a threat. And if so, who do I tell, and how will this be handled?
I think that's an excellent point, Tom. I think there is are things we can teach in journalism school too about, so young journalists keep their own private information off a lot of the platforms, and that of their family. So they protect, so their address isn't out there, their phone number, just have ways that they can protect themselves and their private lives. I think it's very, very important that they learn how to do that, because it is truly a very real threat, particularly for women and people of color. I think it can become, and if they're good at their investigative journalists, they can easily become targets. And so they have to be very savvy about digital safety and their own profile online.
I saw Kathleen shake her head when Tom said, don't go through the comments. Shake her head, yes. Ron, you read the nasty comments on the stories, or do you turn commenting off, or what do you think?
We're a little different, at NATAS, because I actually approve comments. So I've, okay. But in bigger places that I worked, I've told reporters, read the comments if you want to, but it's how you react to the comments. So we, in terms of your mental health care, if people are saying things like, have you thought about this, and having a conversation, that's different as opposed to, Kathleen, you're an idiot, and worse things, right? The name calling, it's interesting that people feel empowered when they're anonymous to say these things. And, I can give an example of working at the Journal Sentinel. And one day I was leaving about midnight, and the security guard says, hey, Ron, there's a caller who wants to talk to you. And I was the page one editor. And so I took the call, and it was a woman who was the wife of a school board president who passed away. And so we had an obituary that ran. But before we had approved comments, someone had put in, well, he was cheating, or he was cheating with his, ex-wife. He was horrible, and all these horrible things that we had never experienced before in an obituary. And so, I called her back, and we talked, and, of course she was upset because A, she saw that, and B, she didn't want her kids to see it. So we made sure that, I went to the funeral. I did everything we could to not necessarily repair the relationship, but to show that we cared about that. And after that, I'm like, we're cutting comments off because we can't approve them. We can't deal with that. Each newsroom probably has a different policy. But I always tell my students, particularly those who are starting out, I'm like, be careful, know that, you must be able to take the critics, but also there's trolling. And you're going to have to be able to do both. And in some of our cases, some I'm like, this is not actually harassment. They don't like your story. And you got to deal with people who don't like your story. And you can engage them to find out, dear so-and-so, I got your note, explain that, as opposed to someone who's calling Kathleen the idiot. So it really comes down to how much energy you have for that. And I don't suffer those kind of things. There are plenty of ways for people to respond, to get their information out. I don't feel like we need to respond to every comment. But also, at NNS, you just don't come up and leave comments. We have a right to, we approve them. And we're very generous in terms of, if you're not name calling, if you don't like the story, that's fine. But if you're calling people idiots and things like that, we don't allow that.
Well, we have I'm sorry, go ahead, Kathleen.
I was just gonna follow up that what everyone is saying is so wonderful. And and Diane is also right. You should have a public social media face.
Mm-hmm.
And especially as you move up in markets, get away from your private stuff. I know you might want to be an influencer. This might be how you built your brand, but you've got to rethink that. And
you can build that with your public page, right?
Exactly. Build that on your public page. And I was at the times when it first started adding comments. And we just have to realize that the people who leave comments are not the same people who wrote letters to the editor, which meant writing something, putting it in an envelope, filling it out, putting a stamp on it. And we know, because this is one of my areas of research, only 10% of the letters of the editor ever appear in print. But somehow we let so many comments appear, and which a person could write the word yawn, and somehow. So we've just got to realize that it seems to come from the same idea of letters to the editor, but it's a completely different animal, of course.
So in terms of emotional safety or avoiding emotional distress, I guess, would you say to reporters, don't read the comments, but make sure someone is assigned to look for comments that rise to a threat level? Would that be your advice?
I mean, Ron is the editor here. I think editors are paid a little bit more, and they should maybe look at it. Because of what I went through recently about possibly changing schools, there is a person who sends me the most horrific, terrible emails that are supposed to be filtered out, but every now and then I have to go into my junk to look for something else. Right. And he's sending things that says like, I want to rape slaves like you. Okay. So that's why it would be nice if you could filter it out. But if you're going to be exposed to stuff like that, I just assume not go through my junk mail.
Gotcha.
So that's why I'm just like,
Yeah. We have about 20 minutes left, and we promised, I've been addressing some of the questions as we go along, but I want to take a few more questions and kind of see where we go. So one of the questions is, I think by nature, because we're all, because we talked about journalist safety, and that's the core curriculum that is designed for college journalism programs. So we use the term journalist very inclusively, right? So we think you're no less of a journalist because you carry a camera on your shoulder rather than a reporter's notebook, right? That's why I call them photojournalists, not photographers or photogs or shooters, right? But we did get a question, do these tips apply for production folks? I am a production assistant for a video production company in Chicago.
I think, if you are working with traumatic events, whether you're producing them, you're editing them, you're having, to see this, or also if you could maybe see something that a boss doesn't see in a reporter's work. You might note that someone is maybe a little less emotionally safe. So I think this goes back to what we're talking about, that everybody is a team.
Yeah.
You know, do you see someone who is lower ranked than you being bullied in the office? Or do you see that a reporter is becoming more and more risky? Not that you would want to say anything to that person's boss, but I think as a team, you've got to see it as like, what's going to be the best for my overall crew. But I'll shut up.
Yeah.
Well,
I think
I would agree with that and say and you can substitute the word media for journalist. You can when we recently and last year put together a traveler safety guide. And this we were going to share with humanitarians who are working, and it's amazing how aligned the traveler safety guide is with the journalism safety guide. Right. Like we're talking about some of the same things you're looking for. So I do think if you're a production assistant, these are applicable. These
Exactly.
I think go ahead, Diane.
No, I just concur with all of you. I think all of us need to definitely, I think they could learn a lot.
And there's obviously going to be some differences on what a production company does in terms of physical safety and equipment. You got to watch out for, boom microphones and if you're using a jib and, all those kind of things, you want to make sure that, but I do think a lot of the same things apply. And the fundamental is be aware of your surroundings and take time to think about your surroundings in terms of physical safety before you actually jump in there and do whatever you've been assigned to do as a production assistant.
And I would venture to say that if you see videos of rallies where they turn around, they're aiming at the media, the people that are willing to do that are not making distinctions between, are you a journalist? Are you a production assistant? Are you that's not, but there's this larger idea that all forms of media are enemies and all forms. So if you're working as a production assistant and you're making something, that doesn't mean people aren't looking at you as a part of this larger.
Well, we're enemies of the people, right?
Right.
In fact, we're protectors of the people, but that's all. Another question, what recommendations do you have for backpack journalists who are on the streets alone and while covering stories are exposed to the streets and the surroundings around them? Does there need to be this, quote, teacher with eyes in the back of their head, end quote, mentality? Diane, Jim was essentially a backpack journalist, right? But he established a bit of a rapport with other backpack journalists and they watched out for each other, didn't they?
Oh, absolutely. I think a lot of freelancers tend to do that. When I think of a backpack journalist, I also think of a civilian journalist. In some of our most dangerous parts of the world, a lot of times it's the people who live there who want the world to know what's going on. And in many cases, really risking it all. We've seen that in the Ukraine. We've seen that in Gaza and that kind of thing. But yes, I think you need one another. It goes back to the whole team concept. It's really risky to do these things alone. You have to have some people you can rely on, because when you're digging for the truth, a lot of people may not want you to find it, may not want you to be able to document what is really happening.
And with more and more newsrooms cutting budgets and bureaus and things, independent freelance journalists are a much bigger thing, right, Ron? This is a big thing, right?
Yeah, we've seen the emergence of that because, we talk about the decline in local journalism, but there have been 4,000 jobs eliminated over the last 5 years in journalism. So independent journalists have become even more, they've always been important, but they're even more important now. And we need them now more because we don't have that personnel that we used to have. So, but in the same thing, they have to be careful. There's no magic solution, but finding your allies, finding your collaborators, as Diane was saying, that can help you. But also, Diane, you said something that's also important. No job is worth losing your life. Mm-hmm. So you've got to make those decisions accordingly.
I know we're getting I just wanted to add something. This is a little bit tangential, but just because I see the one comment from the high school journalism.
I was just going to mention that.
Well,
Yeah.
one of the things I really want to stress is that for high school journalists, for college journalists, for those that work with high school or college journalists, these threats and risks don't wait till you graduate. A high school journalist, a college journalist is a working journalist. So it's not something where we say like, all right, when you get into the real world, we'll give you safety training. You're in the real world. You're working as a journalist. We know that college papers, for instance, for many communities are the local news. So I just want to stress, if there's young people listening or people working with younger people, that they're journalists, that they're reporters. They will face the same challenges as someone who's getting a paycheck from somewhere else.
And in some instances might face more challenges because of being young. People will try to take advantage of you if you appear to be young. So, and also you're trying to go to school and the principal might not like the story. So there are all levels of challenges.
Yes. And I think perhaps the Foley Foundation, we should think about including high school journalists and talk about, because this is just not a college curriculum. It's for anybody, and it's a resource as much as it's a curriculum, right? So maybe we need to do a little outreach there, or maybe you already have. Okay. One last question, and I think we'll wrap up. And coming back to something that I think is really important. We've talked about a little bit, but again, let's kick it around. Question: how do we encourage management to embrace a culture of safety?
One of the things our center is doing now is we're trying to change the young people today because they will be the managers of tomorrow. I think that's why it's important that we do this now, because 5 years from now, I think you will have a different breed of manager. For current managers, they're not all as enlightened as Ron. But I think, as he also pointed out, many want to be, and maybe this hasn't been on their radar. And we're in the process of trying to get this on more people's radars.
I think it's a right now moment, right? Demanding that accountability, using, again, we tell other people's stories. It's now time for us to tell our stories, what we need, and to make sure that managers know we can give them resources and things like this. But, I just don't think that journalism is a passive activity. We have to be active. And that starts with this. Sorry, Tom.
No, I'm right aligned with this. And I think what's happening with journalism safety in the colleges and universities actually aligns with what you're talking about. 6-7 years ago, Diane and I would visit colleges and universities, and they were like, we don't teach safety. That's our focus is on journalism. There are very few schools that we talk to now that say we don't teach safety. A shift has occurred. They're recognizing, and part of it starts at the top where you have industry people saying, we expect people to have this type of safety or be exposed to this. And part of it starts in the schools where it's persistence. We kept talking to them and saying, hey, you don't have to use our curriculum, but you should be teaching a curriculum. You should be teaching safety in some ways. And so change can happen, but it's Diane mentioned persistence before, and you have to be persistent. And if as more and more newsrooms do embrace this, and media organizations, others will have to follow to keep their talent.
Exactly. And I totally concur with you, Tom. And we've found some of our best success when it's embedded in a curriculum, not a standalone course, but something that's part of the newsroom or part of the curriculum of a university or school, where right from the beginning, when they first talk about journalism, they talk about the importance of risk assessment, digital security, their responsibilities as a journalist, how to protect themselves, sources, and just repetition and teaching them to integrate it in what they're learning.
Well, and again, maybe just a little bit tangential, because we're not here to really talk about the curriculum so much as to give tips, but I think one of the smartest things we did when we developed that curriculum was say, we're not developing a standalone class here, because if, first of all, few colleges are going to offer a class in journalism safety, and secondly, it would be an elective. So how do you know that, all of your students are going to get it? And so we developed it in modules that can be dropped into every class. And what we did at Marquette was every journalism class had a different module. And so by the time they graduated, they went through the entire curriculum. And hopefully after 4 years, we've gotten them to the point where they're thinking about safety as second nature. So I certainly applaud the Foley Foundation for all of the terrific work you have done and continue to do. And I don't know, Afia, do you pop back on here and wrap this up, or what do we do? But I want to thank our panelists and the audience, and what terrific questions. And I think this has been a really good use of our time. So
I do pop back up. So thank
Yeah.
you for the slides. Again, just to echo the thank you to Diane, Kathleen, Tom, Ron, and Mark for moderating the discussion. It was so enlightening and just such an amazing opportunity to hear everyone's perspectives and the tips. And I hope all of you listening in today will take these moving forward. This session is being recorded. It will be on the NATAS website in the coming days, which again is chicagomeonline.org. Go to the workshop section. We have put in the chat the links to the module for colleges and universities. So please go through and grab that link. If you miss it before the next 2 minutes and I wrap up, please let us know and we will get that out to you. You can reach out to us on Facebook at Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter under the handle shy_NATAS. Thank you guys again so much. It was an absolute pleasure today, and I appreciate everyone's time as we approach a holiday weekend. Until next time, thank you very much. Have a good day.
Thank you.
Hi, everybody. Thank you. So nice to see you.
I have to apologize. I am so sorry. The tennis unit I'm supposed to supervise, the other adult didn't show up. So the students were left unsupervised. So I ran over there. And then I'm coming back here and I got locked out of my apartment.
Yeah.
And my phone doesn't work on Zoom for some reason. And and I got up I've been out on the road since 7 a.m. today just to make sure I had everything taken care of.
Well, but you joined, no need to apologize. You're talking to a bunch of television people, right? You joined just before I was to introduce you, and that's perfect. That's what happens in the 10 o'clock news, as long as it gets there in time. So.
And I turned my phone off. I'm just so sorry. I did not mean to be disrespectful at all.
No. I'm so glad that you made it. So.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so
Yeah.
much.
Bye. Thank you, Rebecca. Bye.
All right, take care.